So scribe and speech recognition technology. This is for candidates who have a substantial impairment which leads to illegible writing, below average spelling, and please be aware that below average spelling doesn't necessarily mean that you need any access arrangements. Many students spell inaccurately, but we can read exactly what they're trying to say, and so the examiner won't struggle to read what they've written. The issue comes when the target word is unrecognisable, or bizarre as it's often referred to. Then we need to be thinking about what writing help the student needs in order to be able to communicate with the examiner. It could be because they've got incomprehensible grammar, and we do find sometimes that students, when they're writing themselves, the effort of making the pen move across the page is so much for them, it's almost as though there's no energy left for thinking about the content or the grammar. And those students who produce handwriting at the below average rate for their age, they write so slowly they can't get everything down in the time that's allowed. Those with a visual impairment who aren't braille users, those who can't physically manipulate a pen, and those with a temporary injury. We talked about the 5 conditions. In fact, there's a 6th condition when it comes to a scribe. You may have a student who's competent at using a word processor, and under the word processor regulations you have to have the spell and grammar check switched off, but it may be that in some subjects like maths, for example, they can't word process, so they're having to dictate to a scribe, and that would be the 6th condition. In papers assessing reading, English language, modern foreign languages and the SPAG subjects, which are English literature, geography, history and religious studies, marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar are only allowed when they're dictated and they're recorded on the scribe cover sheet. Where a candidate is dictating spelling letter by letter in papers assessing spelling, you're allowed 50% extra time to do that. That's an absolute requirement in modern foreign languages. If the student hasn't dictated the spellings letter by letter, they can't get a score, and that's because spelling is so central to the mark scheme. If a student really doesn't want to lose their marks in English language or the SPAG subjects, there is the option to dictate letter by letter, but what a challenge that is. It may be better actually for the student just to lose those marks and to let the scribe write the spellings. The scribe is permitted in most written papers, and of course the scribe covers speech recognition technology as well. As I've already mentioned, some candidates who word process might need a scribe, for example, for maths and science. The scribe isn't allowed in papers with the application of skills, so for example in ICT or graphic design and in speaking tests. I want to remind you about some special rules relating to a scribe and papers assessing writing. In modern foreign languages, you can only have a scribe if the foreign words are dictated letter by letter. The recommendation is that you record responses and then the student goes back to spell out the words when the paper's complete. And of course, as we've seen, 50% extra time is allowed in that situation. In modern foreign languages, the scribe can write without the spellings being dictated when the answers are in English or Welsh. The point here is that for modern foreign languages, the spelling marks are so central to the mark scheme that you can't just separate them and put them out and mark without including the spelling marks. Just like for a reader, you can have 25% extra time alongside a scribe. I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a moment. Approval for a scribe actually allows a number of different things. It allows the candidate to dictate to an adult who handwrites the answers, or an adult who types the answers, to dictate to their computer using speech recognition technology, and then of course the computer produces text from that dictation. It also allows them to type into a word processor with the spell check, predicted text or grammar check enabled. Normally, when a student is using a word processor, that assumes that the spell check and the grammar check are turned off. If you have permission for a scribe, those can actually be included, but you won't get the marks for spelling when spelling's being assessed. And of course, there is the option to type into a computer which produces speech and is used to dictate to a scribe. That would be for quite a significant disability. It's kind of Stephen Hawking's style. Where any of those 5 options are used, There's no marks for spelling or punctuation or grammar unless they're dictated. Just like for a reader, you can have a one-to-one scribe working with a student, but there must be a roving invigilator who enters the room at regular intervals. Cover sheets. Now, you may well be aware that when a student has a scribe, an oral language modifier, a practical assistant, a sign language interpreter, there's a cover sheet which needs to be completed saying how the arrangement has worked. So, for example, whether the scribe did the punctuation or whether it was the student. Now, where scripts are scanned for online marking, issues can arise if cover sheets are attached with paper clips and staples. Now, non-examined assessments are not an issue because they're not scanned and marked online, so cover sheets can just be attached however you want to. Where the script is handwritten, the cover sheet's placed inside the answer booklet, so that's quite straightforward. There's not really a problem there. The issue arises when you've got a cover sheet for a script that's been word processed. Of course, a word processed script won't be on the exam booklet, it's just on loose leaves of paper, and very often those are attached together. The word processor scripts would not just be tucked inside the student booklet, they would be actually attached in some way. So we've got instructions from different awarding bodies as to how they want the cover sheets attached when there's a word processed script. For OCR, they want us just to place the word processor cover sheet inside the answer booklet along with the word process script, so not attached really in any way. For the other awarding bodies, they ask us to attach the word processor cover sheet with a treasury tag to the front of the script. The thinking here is that if you stapled all those together and that was put through the machine to scan them, that could easily get chewed up and ruined. I don't know whether it's ever happened to you, but it certainly has to me that I've put a pile of papers into a photocopier and forgotten that some of them were either stapled together or paper clipped together, and then they just get chewed up. I guess the point about the treasury tag is that it's really clear and whoever's actually scanning the papers will see that really easily. So please do respect the request from the awarding bodies. There's the Wide Range Achievement Test 5, which has superseded the RAT 4 available from the end of 2017. You can continue to use the RAT 4 for quite a while yet, but the new test includes, as before, spelling, single word reading, reading comprehension. It does have an arithmetic section to it, and it's standardised up to 85 years. The DASH, the Detailed Assessment of Speed of Handwriting, this is up to 16. The reason I've shown you these is to remind you that as evidence for a scribe, the only subtest that we can use within this is the free writing subtest. We cannot use any of the other subtests. There are actually 5 subtests. You can't use any of the other 4, and you cannot use a composite score as evidence for a scribe. So please do keep that in mind. We're now going to watch a video of making an application through Access Arrangements Online for a student to have a reader because they've got a learning difficulty. We're now going to try making an application for a student who has learning difficulties and needs a reader, scribe, and extra time, not because he works slowly, but because he needs extra time to work with the reader and the scribe. So I've already entered his details, and we're going for GCSE, a long-term application, and for the year 17-18. In fact, if I was on the main site, there'd be 2-year options there because one application, of course, covers 2 years. This brings me through to the screen here where I select the arrangements, and I'm going for a scribe and a reader. Note, I'm not ticking 25% extra time because this student doesn't show any evidence of working slowly. This brings me through to the option to add 25% extra time to my application. Now, because I've chosen it on this page rather than the previous page, I will not be asked for evidence of slow working. Basically, the thinking here is that this student works slowly because when they work with the reader needs to reread a number of times, perhaps what's being read to the student, perhaps the scribe needs to read back what's been read, or the student wants it read back to them because they want to check that it's been recorded properly. So basically the whole process of working with the reader and the scribe slows them down. I just want to show you how you go through and make that application in this kind of situation. So we're asked questions about the reader and the computer reader. Is there a medical condition? No. Do we have a report from an assessor from the start of Year 9? Yes, we do. It confirms that reading difficulties exist in their own language. Is the computer reader or the reader the normal way of working? Yes. No sensory impairment. And this is where it's important to tick the correct box. Will the candidate be awarded 25% extra time on the account of his or her disability? And the answer there is yes. This may seem an odd wording, but basically what it's asking is, does the student need extra time to work with the arrangement that they're having? And because I'm ticking the box here and I'm going down this route, I won't be asked for evidence of slow working. There's no EHCP. I've selected the appropriate boxes for the scribe, very similar to those that I selected for the reader, that he has a learning difficulty and he does use the scribe as the normal way of working. Now the wording actually here for the scribe is slightly different, a bit clearer really. Will the candidate be awarded 25% extra time on account of dictating to a scribe for the entire duration of the exam? And the answer to that is yes. So basically here we're saying the student will need extra time, not because they work slowly, not because they've got evidence of slow processing, but the fact that it takes them longer to dictate to a scribe than it would to write themselves if they were able to do that. And as again, no EHCP. In this case, we're asked for evidence of the assessor. Because the student has a learning difficulty and an assessment has been carried out, we need to confirm who carried out the assessment. Now in your centre, when you click on here, anybody who is the recognised assessor in your centre, their name should be on this list. In this case, I'm actually a specialist teacher with an assessment practicing certificate, so I don't need to be named. I'm working within the centre, I'm brought in by the centre, so I'm just going to tick the box for a specialist teacher. But in most cases you would be ticking the name of the person who's been recognised and already entered on Access Arrangements Online. We need to put in the date of the assessment. We're now asked for information about specific scores. So the accuracy score I'm going to leave blank, because I'm basing my application on a comprehension score, a reading comprehension score of 83, so of course below 85. I'm not going to put in the reading score, that's not relevant. I'm also not going to put the spelling score in, because the issue for this student is that they write very slowly. So for example, on the DASH, the detailed assessment speed of handwriting, the free writing assessment, they write at only 80, a standardised score of 80. I do need to answer no and no here, but I can leave these sections blank because I'm not basing my application on, for example, a spelling standard score. We've now got a summary of everything that we've put in, the arrangements we're requesting, evidence of need that we've included, and information about the assessor's report. And I'm confirming everything above. And the application is approved. Information about retaining the evidence. We do have the option to select the cover sheet. For a scribe, we can click here and that will download the exam cover sheet. Approved arrangements, exceptions, recommendations, and any details you entered on the system. So you have got a record of everything that you included in your application. And then it's recommended that we print out the application here. The format will then be clear rather than if you just click print on your PC. When a student is having support from an adult, such as a reader, a scribe, an oral language modifier, a practical assistant, we need to make sure that they understand their role. Their role is completely different to being a helper with the student in the classroom, which many of these people are on a day-to-day basis. So we're told that the centre must ensure that the person appointed is appropriately trained and understands the rules as detailed in this document. And we're told that a training session needs to be organised for invigilators and those facilitating an access arrangement. And those are quotes from the Access Arrangements booklet and the instructions for conducting exams. This year, it's made really clear that centres must retain a record of the training for invigilators and adults supporting access arrangements until any appeal, malpractice or other results inquiry has been completed, and then after the deadline for inquiries into results. Even if there wasn't an inquiry, you need to keep evidence until after the results. And I had a situation this year actually where somebody contacted us, a school contacted us, who had used our online training. So we offer an online training session, just like this video one that we have now, to train both invigilators, and a separate session for working with readers and scribes and their invigilators. And this school had used our online training, and there had been a complaint of malpractice from one of their readers and scribes, and the awarding body needed to see evidence of the training that they had done with the person who was accused. And fortunately they had done training, and we had to send in our course materials, and I transcribed the sections of that training showing how I'd explained what the reader and the scribe etc. can do. So it's really important that you do training, not just a year ago or 2 years ago. You need to make sure that any new invigilators and readers and scribes have training, but also those who've been doing it for years need an update. So you need to really make sure that they do know what their role is. I think this is probably the biggest area of malpractice, where readers and scribes don't quite understand that their role is completely different in the exam, where they simply are reading word for word, writing down word for word what the candidate dictates to them. They're not helping in any way. So please do make sure that your people are properly trained. As well as the online training, which is a fixed price, the training for readers and scribes is £65. Even if you had 50 readers and scribes, it would still only be that. It's a fixed price. We also do offer materials where you can train your staff yourself. So at the very end of the presentation, I'll go through the resources that we sell for charity. You can get them from our website shop, and one of those resources is the materials for you to run this training yourself, the training for readers and scribes. You need to make a decision whether a candidate having a reader or a scribe needs extra time alongside that reader and that scribe. I've mentioned this a couple of times as we've been going through. You need to think about whether actually working with the reader or the scribe slows them down. So, for example, a candidate might need to repeat dictation while the scribe catches up, and they might want the scribe to read back to them what's written to make sure that the dictation was correctly recorded. It might be that the reader needs to read the papers and the answers back again to the student. So obviously both of those situations would be slowing the student down compared to someone else who's not having that reader or scribe help. So you need to think about that. And in fact, this is something that we're encouraging readers and scribes themselves to keep in mind, and make sure the SENCO is aware of that if that's the case. So approval for a reader or a scribe can also allow extra time. It's offered as an option on access arrangements online when an application is made. It's not an automatic entitlement. You need to record the evidence of this in section A of Form 8. So I've already mentioned the type of reasons why this might be required, and you put a note to that effect in section A of Form 8. And this would be evidence from the SENCO, as I said, possibly via the reader or the scribe, not the assessor. This is not something that an assessor can do a test with a student and realise that having a reader or a scribe will slow them down. This is something that the reader or a scribe themselves will notice, and perhaps the SENCO. So please do make sure that you're making room for this possible option. We're going to look now at extra time. First of all, for students with learning difficulties. So for a candidate with learning difficulties, you need evidence either based on a section C of Form 8 from an access arrangements assessor, as we've already seen, no earlier than the start of year 9, and then supplementary evidence on section A of Form 8. Or for a candidate with substantial impairment or physical disabilities, communication and interaction needs, sensory impairments, social, mental and emotional needs, you would need the evidence of the 5 conditions and the report from the appropriate specialist stating what the disability is. So just the same as for a reader and a scribe. The SENCO is required to paint a picture demonstrating the need and providing a compelling, clear and detailed picture of the current need. For a candidate with learning difficulties, that would go in section A of Form 8. Otherwise, we're looking at the 5 conditions, so I'll talk about that in a moment. This is not for a candidate whose difficulty is due to English as an additional language. The view of the awarding bodies is that a student with EAL, if their English isn't good enough to take part in the English exam system, they should learn English for longer. If we can prove that a student with English as an additional language also has underlying learning difficulties, for example, or perhaps has a physical disability or a sensory impairment, all the arrangements that are available to anyone else would be available to them. We do have a short course, just an hour, as part of our Small Bite CPD programme, which gives you some ideas that you can use to assess whether a student's difficulty is due to English as an additional language or whether it is an underlying learning difficulty. We're told that we should always consider rest breaks before applying for extra time, and I think that's good guidance. I think very often we give a student extra time when actually a rest break would be all that they needed. I had a student with dyspraxia a few years ago, and he was very keen to have extra time, but he really needed a rest break because his hand began to ache. So we were able to stop the clock, give him a rest break, and that worked better for him. Also, another student with a medical condition who had ME, and rather than give her extra time, we gave her rest breaks, and she was actually able to bring a pillow with her. She'd lie down and have a short nap. She probably never slept, but just that zone out time was enough to recoup her energy so that she could carry on doing the exam. I think for her it made the difference between doing her exams that year and going on to university rather than having to wait another year. Those rest breaks were much better for her than extra time. That's not to say that rest breaks will work for everybody. Even those with medical conditions may well need extra time instead or as well as, but it's good to think about rest breaks first, and if they're not going to work, then consider extra time. So the core evidence that we're required to provide, we're looking at below average standard scores in assessments of processing. So reading speed, reading comprehension speed, writing speed, and cognitive processing, which includes working memory. Just a brief reminder of the difference between reading speed and reading comprehension speed. Reading speed is simply reading the first time. You start the clock when the student starts reading and you stop it when they've read it for the first time, either silently or aloud. Reading comprehension speed is when you're taking into account how long it takes the student to actually take in what they've read, and they might have to reread 2, 3, even 4 times before they've taken in enough to answer questions, and that of course will slow them down in an exam. So it's important that one way or another we are assessing whether a student has slow reading comprehension speed. This year's regulations have clarified that a below average standard score for reading comprehension can be used for a reader, computer reader, but it cannot be used for 25% extra time. That's because it's only assessing comprehension, it's not assessing speed. It doesn't give us a standardised score for speed. Below average score for reading fluency, reading speed, reading comprehension speed can be used to award a reader or computer reader or 25% extra time, because all of those are measures of speed. So please do bear that in mind. Just a comprehension score on its own won't give us evidence for extra time, but these others, which include assessments of speed, would. The amount of supplementary evidence we need depends on the amount of core evidence that's available. Supplementary evidence, just a reminder, would include examples of unfinished mock exams, an IEP showing the need for extra time, observations from teachers and teaching assistants showing that the candidate needs extra time and how it's used. More likely in a secondary school or FE college, what you're going to be observing is that the student doesn't finish tasks in time. It's not usually possible to give them extra time when the bell goes and students need to move on to the next lesson. You could show a significant improvement in legibility, quality of language or content with extra time, or a significant improvement in the standard score for a timed reading test when extra time is allowed. So for example, if I was using the Access reading test, which takes 30 minutes to complete, If I had a student who hadn't completed in that time, I would give them an extra 7.5 minutes. I'd get them to change their pen, usually for a highlighter, so I can see exactly what they did in the extra time. And I would calculate 2 scores. The score that they got in the set time of 30 minutes and then the score they got in 37.5 minutes. And if there's a significant improvement there, that gives me evidence that the student reads slowly, probably because they need to reread a number of times, and that will prompt me to go ahead and do a test which will give me a standardised score for reading comprehension speed. There's actually only 2 tests that do that, and that's the Lucid Exact and the Diagnostic Reading Analysis. There are a number of other tests which will give us scores for reading speed, just simple reading speed the first time. I've lifted these charts directly from the regulations, and there are a couple of changes here. This shows us that by far the majority of students will have a score of less than 85. There might be a few with low scores, low average scores, and some with no scores below 90. And here we're looking at the core evidence again. The blue section shows those who've got scores of 84 or less. The pink is 85 to 89, and then the yellow is no scores below 90. And basically, the more core evidence you've got, the less supplementary evidence you need. Having said that, you'll see that quite a bit of this is in red, and that's showing us that actually the requirements for a student who has a score of less than 85, you can't just have one simple piece of evidence showing the normal way of working. You do need to show a number of other kinds of supplementary evidence, the type of thing that we've already looked at, even for a student who has a score of 85 or less. You'll notice too that in the pink section, which is those students who have scores between 85 and 89, the low average range, you have to have 2 scores, or that's always been the case, but now they've got to be in different areas of speed of working. So you couldn't quote, for example, 2 reading speed tests. You would have to have different areas of working. We're going to look at that in more detail in a moment. And then there's a lot of evidence, supplementary evidence, if a student doesn't have any scores below 90. Please note here, again, a red bold, a diagnostic report for a student in this yellow category must have been done no earlier than year 9. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail at that section and the yellow category. So to explain a little bit more about that yellow section, a candidate with a cluster of standard scores, at least 3 from different areas for speed of processing or working memory, just within the average range, so between 90 and 94. Must be the normal way of working with an extensive history of need, a formal diagnosis since the start of year 9, evidence of clear substantial adverse effect on the performance and speed of working. And do remember, this is not for a discrepancy between ability and speed or literacy. There's an example on page 32. So basically, having a diagnosis of dyslexia is not sufficient. You still have to have those scores in the low 90s to be allowed to use this. And the regulations have got a new quote this year: for those rare and exceptional cases which fall outside the standard expected category of at least 1 standard score of 84 or less, the amount of evidence of need will vary and will likely need to be greater according to the candidate's standardised scores on tests of speed. That's a quote from 2024, a new quote this year. So just to remind you, core scores between 85 and 89, you need 2 scores from different areas, and for 90 to 94, you need 3 scores from different areas. Reading and reading comprehension are considered to be one area, writing speed another, and then cognitive processing speed. Of course, there are a number of different areas, so it would be quite acceptable to quote, for example, rapid automatic naming and maybe working memory. Those would be considered to be 2 separate areas of cognitive processing. Here we have a reminder that up until a couple of years ago, there was the possibility of some candidates qualifying for a reader or a scribe because they had below average scores for reading or spelling, etc., but they preferred to work independently with extra time. Now that's no longer a possibility. Candidates with learning difficulties must qualify for extra time on the basis of below average speed of reading or writing or cognitive processing or working memory, or of course an education, health and care plan. I think what was happening was that some schools were applying for a student to have a scribe on the basis of perhaps poor spelling, maybe not necessarily illegible spelling, and then that was kind of a sneaky back door into having extra time. So that's sadly been removed. We can't use that anymore. A few tests to assess for extra time. We do have an online session specifically about assessments for extra time, which covers basically every test that there is available in the UK that one way or another could be used to assess for extra time. So if you need to look into more detail and consider what tests you could get access to, then please do ask us, send an email and we'll let you know about that. So the GORT 5, the Grey Oral Reading Test 5, has reading speed in it. The Lucid Exact has reading comprehension speed, as I said. The DASH has writing speed within it. I've already mentioned that. The CTOP 2 has a number of different scores. We're going to look at in a moment the type of tests or subtests within the CTOP 2 that you could use. The RAN-RAS is entirely about rapid naming. It's got 6 subtests of rapid naming within it, so really thorough test. The symbol digit modalities is very old. It was actually put together in the 70s, but there simply isn't anything else that we as teachers can use to assess for visual processing. So we are continuing to use this, even though really it's out of date. You may well be aware that the symbol digit modalities doesn't come with standard scores in the manual. The manual doesn't include a chart showing standard scores. You have to use a formula to calculate each score individually. So with the help of a chartered statistician, we've produced tables for all ages showing the standard scores for oral and written symbol digit modalities. This chart is available to our members, so please go to our website and click on membership. And as I've said, there's a number of other benefits available to members. Membership is £15 a year. The TOMEL 2, or there are other tests of memory and learning, there's the RAML as well, but the TOMEL has 16 subtests within it. You wouldn't be using all of those. Many assessors use the digits forwards and backwards and the letters forwards and backwards to assess for working memory. But any of the other subtests also would be suitable to use as evidence for extra time in exams. We're now going to watch a video of making an application through Access Arrangements Online to have extra time just on its own. I want to show you how AAO is set out when you go to make an application for extra time. We're now looking at an arrangement for a candidate who needs extra time on the basis of a range of scores in the low 90s. So he has a learning difficulty and he has a diagnosis of dyslexia, and he's got at least 3 scores in the low 90s for speed of processing. I've put his details here, which are confirmed here. In this case we're doing A level for a long-term condition, and we're asking for 17, 18, and that will also cover 18, 19. The option of 2 years will be on the real site. We're of course using the training site here. We're now choosing the arrangements that we want. So we're just wanting 25% extra time. And here's how to make an application for this. So this is a student who has learning difficulties which affect their speed of working. They don't have a physical disability or a medical condition or a sensory impairment. We now have a few questions about extra time. Is there an assessment that's been completed since the start of Year 9? Confirmed on Section C of Form 8 with an appropriate qualified assessor, of course, and the answer to that is yes. There's no statement. Do they have at least one below average score of 84 or less relating to speed of working? The answer is no to that. And then we're asked, is there a picture of need, a detailed picture of need, which shows the inspector the requirement for extra time? The answer is no. Because we've said no to this question, that there are no scores below 85, we need to say no to this level of evidence. We've actually got higher levels. Because we've said no to these two, there are another two questions that come up. Do we have at least two low average scores, so between 85 and 89, relating to speed of working? Again, we're saying no, and because we're saying no to that, we're saying no to this level of evidence. We've got higher levels of evidence. Because we've said no to both of these questions, there are no scores below 85 and there are no scores in the low average range, so between 85 and 89. Then there are more questions again that open up to us, and these are the questions. Now I've purposely gone ahead so that you can see what happens that if you try to click forward without answering appropriate questions when you need to, you are specifically asked to answer those questions. So in this case, we're asked, is there a formal diagnosis of a significant learning difficulty which has a clear, measurable and substantial impact on the performance and speed of working? And in this case, we know that we need at least 3 scores in the low 90s, and they must be in different areas of processing. So for example, this particular student has 1 low score for rapid automatic naming, another for working memory, and then a 3rd score on the symbol digit modality, so that's visual processing. So he does have 3 scores in different areas of processing. So I'm going to answer yes to that. And I can confirm that there is a comprehensive body of evidence which can show the inspector the need for 25% extra time. Even though this is an unusual case, this still is an option because we can meet all this criteria. So we're now confirming the evidence that we've put in, how it was validated, and we're confirming the malpractice consequences statement that just confirms that we do have the appropriate evidence. And the application is approved. More information, of course, in that you do need to read carefully what the exam exceptions are and other information that you're given, but you do have a record here of all the evidence that you've put in, and the JCQ inspector may well want to see this. So I'd like to ask you please to pause the presentation now and think about which tests you have available to assess for extra time. Are there any gaps? So please pause the presentation now. A bilingual dictionary, some students would qualify for 10% extra time when they use their dictionary. It used to be 25%, but this has been tightened up. This is a rare and exceptional circumstance. Up to a maximum of 10% extra time can be granted if the student meets all of these following criteria. They've been in the UK for less than 3 years. It used to be 2 years, but now it's 3 years. And they came to the UK with no prior knowledge of English. This is not intended for students who were taught in English or prepared for English qualifications overseas before they came to the UK. It literally is those with virtually no prior knowledge of English. English wouldn't be spoken at home. The student would need to use the dictionary extensively, delaying the answering of questions, and extra time, of course, would be the normal way of working. So these are students who have the bilingual dictionary in class, and they're often needing to look up words as they read. Extra time to use the dictionary, this 10%, is allowed for GCSE and the other level 1 and 2 qualifications, but it's not allowed for GCE and any level 3 qualifications. So have a look at page 71 for the list of the qualifications that this is available. I think the thinking of the JCQ is that if a student's doing a level 3 qualification, they would expect them to have a good level of English and not have to keep checking their dictionary. Access arrangements online will show a date 26 months from the date that you apply for this 10% extra time. However, permission is actually to the end of the month, 36 months from the date that the student arrived in the UK. And you're going to need to cross out the expiry date and work out the date 36 months after the student came into the UK and put that on the application approved notice. The evidence for this will be compiled, for example, by the SENCO or perhaps the EAL coordinator. On the screen you can see a document. This is available through our shop, and it just gives you a format to put all the evidence required by the JCQ together. There's some notes about how to complete it. I'm going to talk about these resources, as I said, at the very end of the presentation, so you'll be able to see where you can get hold of that. Modified papers on access arrangements online. There's a list of arrangements very similar to the arrangements generally covered by the access arrangements booklet. There are some slight differences, but the list is there, or you can have a look on page 74 of the regulations. You cannot apply for modified papers for functional skills through access arrangements online. Papers that are available, I'm not going to go through every paper, I just want to point out some recent new ones. So there's always been A4 modified 18-point bold and A3 modified 24-point bold. There's also A3 modified 36-point bold, which is available now. That's new this year. Not in all subjects, so you will need to check by going onto Access Arrangements Online and making an application. If there isn't an A3 modified 36-point bold in the drop-down list of papers available, you'll know that that's not available in that subject. There's also, of course, Braille papers available. If, in exceptional cases, you need non-standard papers, so for example an alternative format modified in large papers, or you need a modified language alongside a modified format, so those two together in the same paper, those are not standard issues. So you will have to show the awarding body that all other arrangements have been considered and ruled out before you apply for one of these non-standard papers. That's not to say you won't get it. The awarding bodies, the departments that produce the modified papers are absolutely amazing, and they do their very best to help you, but you do need to make clear that you haven't just decided that lightly. You have looked at everything else, and this really is the option that you need. There's also the coloured enlarged paper. Now you're allowed to open 90 minutes early to photocopy and to print from a non-interactive PDF. And the great thing about the non-interactive PDF is that it reduces the possibility of human error and gives you a better print quality. Remember that if you photocopy or you print from the non-interactive PDF, it's possible that questions relating to scale might be affected. So if you're doing that with a maths paper, please remember that you need to check if there are any questions relating to scale. There's the non-interactive PDF for a computer reader, or as we've already seen, to produce a coloured or enlarged paper. The non-interactive PDF, it's called that because you can't type into it. So if a student is using a computer reader with their non-interactive PDF, and they're also using a word processor or perhaps speech recognition technology, they will have to jump between screens, or perhaps to have two separate computers. That's probably unlikely, but that sounds horrible to me. But many of our students are quite used to jumping between screens, and I've often noticed that for many of them that's not an issue at all. Only one order is required if you've got several candidates needing the same PDF paper. So it doesn't mean that you've got to order one for each student. If you're ordering a PDF paper for the geography GCSE exam and you've got 3 students who need that, you only need to order one. If you need an A4 modified 18-point bold in a non-interactive PDF format, you'll need to contact the awarding body. That's not a standard paper. They will be able to produce one for you, but you'll have to go direct to the awarding body to ask for that. Centres, of course, must maintain the security of non-interactive PDFs, ensure that only authorised members of staff have access, and you mustn't carry out any further modifications of PDF papers. We're now going to have a look at making an application through Access Arrangements Online for a modified paper. I want to show you how to apply for a modified paper. I'm using the training site, of course. I don't want to actually order a paper, so there are a couple of things that are slightly different here, but I think you'll get the idea of how to go about ordering a paper. So we're creating a new candidate. This isn't a candidate who had access arrangements before. So here are the details which I've already saved. So I'm going to place a new order for a modified paper, and I want the paper for June 2018. And I'm now selecting the paper for the candidate. It's an AQA paper that I want. And I'm looking for applied business. Here we have the GCSE applied business paper, and I'm selecting that. Now I've got to select the modification that I want, and I want an A3 modified 24 point bold paper. That's it. I'm going to select and continue. So I've got then the option to add another paper for that candidate. So I hope you can see that's pretty straightforward. If you have selected the paper, then that has gone through to the awarding body. You don't need to phone up to check that they've got it. This is a live system, and if you can see it on your screen as we do here, then you know that the awarding body has received that order. There have been some changes to the alternative site for conducting exams regulations. It may be that you have to have a group of students sitting papers at an alternative site not part of your registered centre. It may be they're not even part of a registered centre at all. Perhaps you've got a student in hospital, or they need to take the paper at home, or perhaps you've got so many students in your FE college that you're having to use a local church hall in order to accommodate everybody. That would come under the alternative site regulations. There's also occasionally a situation where a student is part of a consortium or a multi-academy trust. The situation there would be that perhaps the student is registered in one academy, but they go to an alternative academy perhaps for one or two other subjects, and they would be entered through their home academy, but they perhaps need to sit the paper in one of the other academies. And so someone would come and collect the paper from the home academy and take that to the alternative academy. So that would come under the alternative site regulations. You apply through the JCQ alternative site form, not through Access Arrangements Online, and you'll need to give the date, the address and the number of students, etc. A member of staff would come and collect the paper and securely transport that to the site, and they're allowed to open 90 minutes early in order to do that. On page 68, there's a list of the qualifications that this arrangement applies to. If it's another qualification, you need to contact the awarding body, the appropriate awarding body, to ask for information about how you go about applying for this. So we've looked at the arrangements where we have to make an application through Access Arrangements Online. We're now going to look at a group of arrangements that require referral to an awarding body. And while we're doing that, we're going to look in a little bit more detail about why we might need to refer to an awarding body. So these specific arrangements include up to 50% extra time, more than 50% extra time, a practical assistant, an oral language modifier, and if you tick the box Other on Access Arrangements Online, then that will also refer you through to an awarding body. That's most likely to be for something like a new piece of technology that a student's using, that perhaps the awarding bodies aren't aware of, they've not had time to review, and you would need to ask someone at the awarding body to look into that technology. Also, an application can be referred through Access Arrangements Online if it's not been approved, although, as we saw earlier, we need to check that the application actually meets the JCQ criteria before we do that. Remember that a referral is not intended to discourage applications. It's just that the awarding body, a human being at the awarding body, needs to make the decision. It's not something that the computer can decide about. Oral language modifier, that's not on the list. You may have noticed when we were looking at making applications earlier that oral language modifier is not mentioned on the list on Access Arrangements Online. You will have to select Other. This is considered to be such an extreme arrangement that you need to select Other, and a human being will consider your case. If you want something unusual that's not standard, so for example a student needs to use squared paper for maths, or I was asked recently about a student who gets their numbers reversed, and I was asked whether they might be able to have a card in front of them showing which way round the 9 and the 6 go, etc. That's the sort of thing you would tick Other, and the awarding body would look into it. There'd certainly be no problem with having squared paper or a little card showing the orientation of numbers. And as I've said, a new piece of technology not mentioned in the regulations, and exemptions. If a student needs an exemption, you would have to request through the other selection. When you're referring to an awarding body, you need to make sure that any correspondence you send in has the referral reference number in it. You need to give details of all exam entries at this stage, though of course the wonderful thing about access arrangements online is that one application covers everything. So if you're just applying for a straightforward reader, scribe, 25% extra time, you don't need to know what exams each student is doing with which awarding body. That can save a lot of time. When we were having to send in paper applications pre-EAA2, we had to know exactly what papers each student was doing with which awarding body. Of course, awarding bodies reserve the right to request further evidence or specific evidence, and you will get a reply by email from each awarding body separately. And it may be that one awarding body says yes and another says no, simply because of the subject the student is studying with them. So let's have a look at the arrangements that come under the 26-month rule for evidence. There are only 2 of these now. So we've got between 26 and 50% extra time for candidates with learning difficulties, and oral language modifier for all candidates. So the rule here is that any assessments must have been done within 26 months of the final exam. So you cannot use old assessments. If a student is in FE, you probably will have to redo the assessments. And please note that this is for candidates with learning difficulties who need up to 50% extra time. And for an oral language modifier, it's all students, regardless of what their need is. Even if they're deaf, you would need to have this evidence. And I'm going to show you in a moment exactly what that evidence is. So the assessment would be carried out by an access arrangements assessor. We need to use Form 8, and we're looking here for well below average scores, 69 or less. We can't give evidence as percentiles or age equivalents. The score has to be 69 or less, so right in the bottom 2% of the population. These are arrangements that are considered to be quite extreme. Between 26 and 50% extra time is an exceptional arrangement. EAA2 is set up to reject all requests, so you'll have to refer through to an awarding body so that your application can be considered individually. I want to remind you of an exception here, which we have actually already covered, but you don't need to apply for 50% extra time if you've got a candidate who's eligible for a reader or an oral language modifier, but the subject doesn't allow it. They can't have the reader or the OLM, for example, in the English reading papers. Also, if a candidate's eligible for a scribe and they're dictating spellings letter by letter, then you can have 50% extra time then without any special application. And that permission is on the approval notice. So for up to 50% extra time, you need 2 very substantially below average scores for processing speed, and they need to be in different areas of processing. For students who have learning difficulties, standardised scores will always be required. You cannot have 50% extra time based entirely on an educational health and care plan. This is for learning difficulties only, but if you have a student who needs 50% extra time, you've got to show those scores of 69 or less, even if the student has an education health and care plan or a statement. So 2 of the following: reading and reading comprehension speed, one category, writing speed, another category, cognitive processing speed, and of course there are a number of different areas that come under cognitive processing speed. For candidates with a physical disability or a sensory impairment, you need evidence of the 5 conditions plus evidence about the amount of extra time that's required and how you decided that, and whether the candidate is working with a computer reader, or a scribe. You of course also need the letter confirming what the disability is. We looked at that in more detail later. And we're told that there needs to be a substantial body of evidence showing that 25% extra time is not sufficient. More than 50% extra time is really for very substantial impairments, never for learning difficulties alone, even if the candidate has an education, health and care plan. Again, you have to refer through to the awarding body. You'll make the application. That will refer you through to the awarding body, where each application will be considered individually. More than 50% extra time, you have to look at page 30 to see exactly what evidence is needed. It's 4 of the 5 conditions, plus the same evidence as for up to 50% extra time, but they also will ask whether the student is working independently with a braille or modified enlarged paper. Practical assistant, as you know, is for candidates who can't perform some practical tasks independently because they've got difficulties relating to manual dexterity or physical coordination. EAA2 will reject all requests, whether it's for a practical paper or a written paper, and you'll need to refer through to the awarding body. So we're told a little bit more information over the last couple of years about this. It's just explaining in more detail why you have to make individual applications for a practical assistant. Tasks must be specifically approved in advance by the awarding body. So they will need to know the kind of things that a student won't be able to do and that the practical assistant will have to do. And in doing so, the awarding bodies are making sure that assessment objectives are not compromised. The practical assistant follows the candidate's instructions to carry out tasks as specifically approved by the awarding body. So as I said, any tasks carried out would have to be approved in advance. A one-to-one practical assistant doesn't need a separate invigilator, but you would need to provide a roving invigilator who enters the room at regular intervals.